Good morning is supposed to mean we're gonna get started here, so we'd like to have your attention, and we thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to open us in a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for this day. We just praise you for it. We thank you for another opportunity at life today. Pray that our thoughts and comments would be guided by you. Your blessing is always sought and appropriate for this audience, and we just pray, Father, that you would bless this time. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Okay, today we're going to start off with a presentation by Bob Dallas. He's going to give us, the committee, an update on some late things that have happened with regard to interlock devices and some new news that comes from the National Safety Council. I'd like to give Bob that opportunity to go through that with us. We're also, the three things that are on the agenda today are the interlock devices. We have some chiefs who want to comment on the reclassification issue, and then we'll go to the AOC and the judges panel after that with their recommendation that they've amazingly been able to come together. I think they've come together on it. Well, I don't see any smiles out there, but hopefully they are. All right, Bob, thank you for coming this morning. Merry Christmas to you, and you're on.
Week that the National Transportation Safety Board came out with a recommendation that ignition interlock be applied on first offense, and they based that on the data that they studied. And what I wanted to do, in addition to bringing that to the committee's attention, which I have a copy of their press release, is to also discuss the fact that other organizations too have supported it, which I think also look at data very closely and reach the same conclusion. They include the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, the National Conference of State Legislators, which has a short briefing which I presented to you on that, as well as the Centers for Disease Control, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the Governor's Highway Safety Association, of which the Georgia Governor's Office of Highway Safety is a member, and Mothers Against Drunk Driving, both at the national as well as the state level. Each of these organizations have come out favorable towards the idea that ignition interlock on first offense is effective in reducing recidivism and abiding by the state's laws respecting driving following a conviction for a DUI at .08. And what I've also provided to each of you is a language which is extremely comprehensive that reflects what the state of Washington did in terms of changing its law. And I bring that to your attention only in the sense that as the committee looks at it, recognizing full well that the Georgia model will be reflective of our Georgia values and cultures as defined by the legislature, I just wanted to have something in your hands that's reflective of possible different kinds of language. And certainly I recognize that the committee is looking very closely, and we're very appreciative of .15 and above being mandatory. The idea, though, that .08 and up to just under .15 being discretionary, we believe serves several purposes. First, the data is supportive of the fact that these things work. And the second thing, I think, which is very important, is that for offenders who've been convicted on first offense, it allows them, as we would recommend, to drive without either a suspension and without a restriction, but having the interlock device in place. And what that does is it gives an option to the court to consider the offender and their circumstances and ask the question whether this is the right solution for them. We also know that another thing that it does is it does support the treatment options associated with whatever that offender is receiving, as well as the judge's monitoring, as well as the probation monitoring. And one of the main reasons is because the data collected by these devices is robust. It captures the data associated with when the offender blows and what kind of results they have with that. Some of them are advanced. Some of them will even capture video if that's indeed what the offender has on the device. So it's just another tool available to the adjudicative system, which we believe helps support the conclusion, which is reducing the number of DUI-related deaths for these offenders. And we would point out that is a very competitive market with 13 manufacturers, and that the cost is in the neighborhood of $250 a day associated with these things. And granted, it is a private sector, but akin to the insurance industry, it's a solution which I think in a competitive market makes it a fair alternative for offenders who've been convicted of the first-time DUI. So we just wanted to present the fact that these organizations, nationally very well respected, have been supportive of the idea of making available ignition interlocks on first offense. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, that was briefly the presentation I'd like to make, and very happy to answer any questions the committee might have.
You want to comment on the map information from NCSL that just came out? You've got a copy of this in your folders, by the way. Map out new solutions in ignition interlock, map 21. You want to comment on that, Bob?
Yes. What that does basically is under the new Federal Transportation Act, it strongly encourages the use of ignition interlock on first offense. It also provides a financial incentive to those states who do so. And I'm not suggesting it's going to be in the tens of millions of dollars to every state, but it does reflect that the National Conference of State Legislators have looked at this in conjunction with what the Congress had said. This is a good thing for the nation in terms of reflecting the federal policy on it. And I know in some instances there are some that talk about a hard suspension. I think the data, though, really is pretty clear that when you have these devices in place, they serve as a better tool to ensure that the offender is in compliance with the law. And this committee has been consistent in one point. We don't want laws on the books that the offender are going to generally break because they roll the dice. And what this device does is ensure compliance and consistent with treatment. But the MAP 21 and the letters brief, which is from the NCSL, I think does a good job of summarizing the fact that there's been a shift with data, best practices, and technology to say this is a better tool for a better result.
Okay. Any questions for Mr. Dallas? Okay. Chairman Golick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dallas, on the MAP 21 and the financial incentives that you referred to, my understanding, secondhand admittedly, is that we're talking realistically about less than $20 million to be divided around the nation.
Yes, sir.
If, and this is the main question, if, which $20 million would be great, for our budget purposes in total, but split throughout 51 jurisdictions may not be that much. But my understanding, albeit secondhand, is that the ability to access those federal dollars is contingent on a state's compliance with all of the components, for lack of a better term, of MAP 21, not just the interlock piece of it. Is that a correct statement, or am I mistaken?
I think in general that's probably correct.
Which includes lowering raising the driving age to, I believe, 18. Which my sense is that might be a non-starter in this state.
As a writer, you might see here of what a parent should do with teens, recognizing this is how we do it in Georgia, agreeing with you 100%, Mr. Chairman. MAP 21 and what it dictates is for NHTSA to come up with the regulations associated with this. And my understanding is that they are currently in the process of doing that. So I would be unable to tell this committee or anybody else exactly what that will be. I will say this. The financial incentive, while nice, to me would not be the driver behind this, because I look at it from the data perspective. And the data is pretty clear. I mean, I have a chart here which, for example, shows those states with interlock requirement and shows those with second-time offender requirements. And the numbers are pretty clear that those that have the first-time offenders, they're better. And that, to me, is what drives it. I mean, there's not a folk on this committee who hadn't worked with me over the years. I would not be here if the data wasn't supportive of this. So while the money's nice, it's the result that I would suggest to this committee and the legislature is what really should guide their decision.
That's a point well taken, but it is, sincerely, but from a financial standpoint, that's really, it's not realistic, because you have to go and comply with all the components of MAP 21, which
Fair enough.
is not going to happen. But your point's well taken, that really is not the driver.
Yes,
I just
sir.
want to make sure that was clear.
It is.
Thank you.
Other questions? I don't see any other questions for you, Bob. I appreciate you coming and bringing that to us.
Thank you, sir.
We'll duly take that into consideration.
Thank you all, and I appreciate what you do.
Thank you.
Have a great Christmas.
Okay. Let's see where my cheat sheet is here. Well, we're going to welcome Chief Joe Worthman of the City of Jefferson and Chief Brian Kelly of the City of Gainesville to come up and talk to us about, you guys checked your guns at the door? No, I'm sorry. Okay, you didn't do that. All right. Anyway, we're glad to have you. I know you've sat through a number of these presentations and bring us the benefit of your views on reclassification.
Good morning. I want to thank you all for having us here today, and thank you for what you do. I know sometimes in the media, politicians get beat up, but you devote a lot of your time and for what you do for us, and we appreciate it. My name is Joe Worthman. I'm a police chief in Jefferson, Georgia, which is Jackson County. Been a police officer now for 35 years. I was asked to sit and observe by Executive Director Frank Rotundo of the Georgia Association of Chiefs of Police, and our board was interested and concerned in this legislation. Brian, you want to go on from there?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and the rest of the board. I'm Brian Kelly, Chief of Police of the City of Gainesville, located in Hall County. I've been a peace officer for going on 20 years now. We are a department, full-service police department, as well as a full-service municipal court. And as Chief Worthman here has indicated, we definitely are concerned, depending on which direction this Title 40 study goes to, whether it's decriminalization. Of course, as we heard in the last meetings, listening to some of the justices and prosecutors and solicitors, that would bring in a whole host of concerns as far as on the enforcement wing, with continuing stops, whether you had companion charges with these decriminalized charges as well, and also how we lead into search and seizure issues. Of course, with some more information that's been coming across, seems the direction of the committee, of course, is to try to improve the efficiency of the court system, make sure we're not bogging down the court system to get these violations moved through as rapidly as we can. In my jurisdiction, as well as in Chief Worthman's, some other chiefs that we've talked about, we do not see an extreme amount of these equipment violations going through the whole process. And what I mean by that is going through either requesting jury trials. We're seeing in my jurisdiction 35–40% of them are being paid off on online payments prior to even having to step into the arena of the court. I think that's something that's definitely beneficial for the committee to consider looking at to help those individuals that do realize that there is a equipment violation they may have that they can handle before going in front of the courts. I definitely support, along with some other members of the Chiefs panel, that we look and support the judge systems and the municipal court systems on being more efficient to resolve those issues and backlogs. They can definitely think it's an administrative issue to look at. Our concern is definitely we want to make sure we keep the enforcement wing into these violations. Some of the studies that have come out from the Chief Justice Committee that we've been privy to read as well, we're leaning more to definitely liking those a little more, that where we're reclassifying the different types of misdemeanors. I think it's important that most of all we keep in mind that I think the whole goal from our end is that we keep the roadways safe, we keep the vehicles safe. Chief Worthman and I have actually discussed, as the panel has as well, putting some other ideas on how to handle these violators, whether it's assessing the fine amounts if they can't pay it, that they put them toward their licenses or tags on the renewals, or I think there was discussion in the last meeting about the income tax returns, trying to go after payments that way. There's some things that we do in our systems that we think might be interesting to the panel, is if with the whole goal of keeping motor vehicles, keeping roadways safe, if you have a violation, for example, let's say a headlight violation, give the violator an opportunity to fix that violation before they're able to come to their court date, whether it's 20 days, 30 days, or what have you. Bring the vehicle by a law enforcement that wrote the citation, have them inspect that vehicle. If it's working, then we can add some forms similar to like our NALPROS form that we do. If we're going to NALPROS citation through court, say yes, Officer A has inspected this vehicle, the violation alleged has been corrected, send it through the system, and then in my mind and my thoughts, it never would make it in front of the judge, so it's taking care of it on the front end and helps to reduce some of the backlog in the court case.
And I agree with that. We do that now in our police department for the few that we do, right, for taillights, tag lights, or traffic headlights at night, which is a safety concern. If you come and get them, the violations fixed, we go ahead and no process the ticket, and doesn't even make it to a court. And at the end of the day, that's what you want. You don't want cars driving down the road without tail lights or headlights on that could create a hazard for the other motoring people in the community. just to reiterate what he said, we just want to keep, we'd like to see an enforcement side of that. There is some suggestions in this Chief Justice Committee report. You know, most people do pay. Some people just need more time, but there is a small percentage that just want to stick their finger and snub their nose at anything legal, and I think they need to be addressed. They don't want to follow the system, the laws of our state and communities. Thank you.
Questions of the chiefs from any of the committee members? Chairman Golding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for taking the time to be here and as an overall matter for what you do generally. The thought of an equipment violation and then fixing it before it never even gets to a court, I mean, from a customer service standpoint, and more importantly from a public safety standpoint, that obviously makes a lot of sense. I'm just wondering about the logistics. I mean, you're in smaller to middle-sized jurisdictions. I'm wondering, selfishly, from a Cobb County perspective, I mean, they bring it by. Do they have to go to the officer involved, or is it anybody who, can you walk me through that? Do they physically come down to the police department and say, I got this, and who deals with them? I got this ticket for this equipment violation. Can you take a look at it? Is that a formal process? Is it more informal? And I'm just wondering, again, from a selfish standpoint, how that would work in a larger jurisdiction. We're all for going ahead and taking care of those things before they even get to a courtroom, but I'm wondering how that would how it logistically works where you're at, and then I'm wondering how could that possibly work in a larger jurisdiction with all the shift changes and same officer, not the same officer. Is there a particular department or a group of officers at a particular time, let's say in a particular precinct? Do they go to their home precinct? Can you walk me through that?
Well, what we do at Jefferson, we're not a big agency, 24 sworn. People come to the station during our operating hours, which are from 7:30 to 5:30. We do things for car safety seats for the children, van inspections, record inspections. It wouldn't have to be the original officer that wrote the citation. We have people working. They just call somebody in off the road. It's operational. $5 headlight or $10, whatever headlight costs anymore. We check. They turn it on. It works. And we go from there. We see the ticket. We go inside. My clerk goes through the process on the computer, making sure that doesn't even get to the courtroom.
And so that's electronically done.
Mm-hmm.
And that gets to the solicitor.
Right. And it wouldn't even get to the court. It's taken out of the system.
And
there's no points or
right.
Well, it wouldn't be anyway on a equipment violation.
Does the person, I mean, by virtue of getting the citation, the individual has their court date on it, right? When they get that citation, do they just go by the word of mouth of the officer at that point if you don't have to show up, or do they get another notice from the state court or whatever court of jurisdiction?
No, they'll get their copy that it's been taken care of.
On the spot.
Right.
And that gets sent electronically to the solicitor or whoever?
That gets no process. They fix their violation, so it doesn't make it to the courtroom.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that it's much more of an informal process when they come down.
And you would have your right if you felt like you were driving with your headlight was working when it wasn't.
Sure.
Still have that day to go before the judge and tell me your story. To me, as a driver, if I had a tail light or a tag light out and it was $10 or $15 to get it fixed as opposed to a $50 or $100 fine, what am I going to do? I'm going to go get it fixed and let them show that I got it fixed where it gets taken care of.
I'm just concerned about, from a larger jurisdiction, how it seems to me just on raw volume alone, it would have to be a much more formalized process within individual precincts. You're going to have somebody who's dedicated to that. Not that you're going to have a stream of people every day coming with equipment violations. I doubt that, although there'll be more than I think most folks, including me, think. And then that's a resource manpower issue.
But again, that's
potentially. And I'm not saying that to poke holes. I'm just trying to run the traps from a logistical, how can we make this work standpoint.
Well, it's just another tool to get the system working more efficiently. The judges have come up with some things on the payments, attaching liens to tax refunds, checks, on the driver's license, on the car registration. Just another tool that we may be able to get at these violators to make the system more efficient and quicker to go through.
Thank
and
you.
To make this car safer on the road.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions for the chiefs? Yeah, I got a couple. Chief Kelly, you mentioned 35 to 40% of the equipment violations are paid.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, be more specific. Of all our violations, not just specific equipment violations, but of all violations issued that do not have to have a return requirement to come to court, they're paying those through an online payment system via the City of Gainesville Municipal Court System.
Okay, all right. What, do you have any feel for the number of equipment violations you actually have?
I don't have a specific number at hand, but I was speaking with our municipal court judge and court clerk. Very few numbers are we seeing that are either issued by our officers for citations. Of course, a lot of the officers' actions are to make those stops and to, one, first ensure that the violator understands that their tail light may be out. There's a lot of times they do not. So we do issue a lot of warnings on those types of violations. We don't see an extreme amount of number of equipment violations coming through the court system, either to be paid prior to by the online system or either going through the in front of the judge for a case. So what both Chief Worth and I have seen through research some of our numbers, that's a very low amount of violations that are being processed through our court systems, and we would imagine that it's would probably be consistent with departments through our size. Gainesville's about 35,000 on population. We deal with about 125,000 commuter population. I'm a 100 officer sworn department. And if I may just address a little bit more to Chairman Gold's question, a little different that we'll do, similar to what Chief Worthman does with Jefferson on the inspections. We have a little more different process to where, again, any officer that is on duty can check to ensure that the equipment violation has been corrected, similar to like the vehicle identification number inspections. If you buy a new trailer that didn't have a VIN on it and you put it on there, you bring it by the police department, we'll inspect it, fill out the form. It has been inspected, verified on this date by a certified peace officer, have the VIN in place. Similar thing that we would do with equipment violation. It has been inspected, and we can take that form there and then process it through our court clerk so they can all process the ticket on their end. And then we'll also send a notice back out to the violator that there's no need to appear in court, that the violation has been resolved through being able to be inspected. So a little more formal process and doing it right on the spot. To kind of some checks and balances, but it still has a tracking system on that.
And may I add also, you was mentioning you're from Cobb County. I could understand logistically if you're 200-300 miles away, drive all the way back up. I'm sure there'd be some ways you could write legislation that other agencies with a form, and as electronically efficient as we're getting now, that this stuff could all be taken care of electronically to an email, a fax, anything. Go if you're down in Albany.
Okay, close enough.
Sorry. But if they could go there and have somebody there check it and then electronically send a form to the Jefferson Police Department that this was fixed, that we could take care of it then. There's always ways to do it.
Always ways to do it.
There's always ways to do it.
Anybody else got any questions for the police chiefs? I was interested in just a kind of an anecdotal feel for the number of times that equipment violations result in a probable cause search.
I'm sorry?
How many times do equipment violations result in a probable cause search? And is that, well, if you get an answer to that, it'll be fine.
I would say there's a very good chance that these equipment violations will lead to probable cause searches or companion charges. We may stop a violator for a tail light or tag light out and determine that violator is under the influence, or maybe driving with no insurance or suspended license. So a lot of times it's our intent, keeping public safety in mind, that we want to ensure that the violator first knows that there's equipment violations. If you're driving at 3 o'clock in the morning, one headlight on and no brake lights on, a lot of times people don't realize that. I can't, count the number of times that I've made traffic stops myself, and people, "Sir, remember your tail lights out." And so I didn't realize that my dash lights are out. Well, when your dash lights go out, it's pretty much a good clue that they're connected wire, and that's why your tail light's out. Usually, if there's no secondary charges or you're not under the influence, there's not anything else coming back with your registration or your license, my practice was I'd warn you. You get a written warning, try to get it fixed, or if it's, to an extent that it's no tail lights at all, do your hazards work to at least get you home. Our whole stance behind this is to make sure that we increase public safety and want to make sure that we hold those accountable to make sure those vehicles are in a safe manner before we have them on the roadways, whether it's headlights, bald tires, issues of that nature.
Just follow up on that. You said there's a large possibility that it'll lead to search and higher charges. Do you have any idea of the percentage on that, just kind of anecdotally?
No, I do have officers that do that. We have canines, and if we, through questioning, alerts us to maybe some other activity, I mean, we can ask. They have the right to say no, search the vehicle. I mean, that doesn't hurt to ask a question. But that does occur. It's just further an investigation.
Okay, all right. If these equipment violations were handled differently, I'm going to assume you haven't seen the presentation that's about to be made. Okay. Well, why don't you stick around until after that, and if you want to testify again on what you see in this presentation, we'd be glad to have you come back up and speak to us.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming down. We really do appreciate it. Have you guys come up north, make the trip down here,
Thank you so much.
test some of the Atlanta traffic this morning. There you go. Okay. Well, Mike, where's Mike? There he is. Okay. Mike is going to bring us the results of what the eminent panel of judges has representing the courts have come up with in terms of what they are looking at, something they come together on. But first of all, I think you're going to talk to us a little bit about the data that's behind these conclusions, and Steve is going to be presenting that to us. Is that correct?
Well,
you do whatever way you want.
sure. What I'd like to do is kind of sail through how we got here today. First thing I want to point out is that even though as an employee of the Administrative Office of the Courts, I serve the judges and the other court-related agencies, there have been so many people who have been involved in this process that the Chief Justice initiated meeting with us, and that would be ACCG, GMA. The prosecutors have been a fundamental part of the process with the judges. We've had people from misdemeanor probation, just a host of people who've commented and provided their input into the recommendations, or what I will call proposals, because really this is a starting point that we'd like to hand to the legislators, the policymakers, to begin to work through this. This started out as...
Excuse me, everybody's got a copy of this presentation in their folder.
And this is up on the screen as well. This started over a year ago as a look at decriminalizing certain traffic offenses. That was the recommendation that the Special Counsel on Criminal Justice Reform made, was that it be studied. We have endeavored to do that. One of the earliest things we found was that decriminalization was not popular among a lot of the stakeholders, particularly law enforcement and prosecutors. So that was, I think, the first thing that came off the table. What we, I think, began to see as we dug in is that this is not just a question of what the penalties are. It's a question of what does our traffic citation and our traffic court system look like. It's complex. There are a number of phases, and there are a number of different ways the courts do things. Our courts are very independent. They try novel approaches when they come up with them. For instance, I think the idea or the concept of null processing a traffic or a tail light out makes sense to most people. But courts, and we have just alone almost 400 municipal courts in Georgia. The courts do things many different ways. Law enforcement agencies within those jurisdictions do things many different ways. So we've been trying to unpack, if we change these classifications, if we make other modifications, what does this mean for citizens? What does it mean for the courts? What does it mean for law enforcement, local governments, et cetera? The slide I have up here, which is in your presentation, is really just a kind of a very high-level walkthrough of what might happen if you're issued a traffic citation. Phase one, being issued the citation. you may be booked. There are a number of reasons why you might do that. For instance, if you're a foreign driver or an out-of-state driver that our law enforcement officers don't think they can reach out to under an interstate compact or something like that, you may be booked and asked to post bond. Bond forfeiture, which is something that the chiefs pointed out as well, which is the process of prepaying and then resolving your traffic citation that way, and that's, I think, instrumental in the courts. We find a very, very high percentage of traffic citations are resolved that way. Also, there's arraignment where an offender comes before a judge and can make a plea if the citation hasn't been dealt with through pretrial or dismissed, or they can plead not guilty when they move through the process. That's one of the things that we've looked at when it comes to data. Before we get into the data a little bit, there are two different ways to approach this we found in terms of the why. We've looked at administrative issues. Are there things that are complicating the process where we're probably spending judicial or court or law enforcement resources unnecessarily, or where they should be repurposed or refocused to provide better bang for the buck, much like what the Special Counsel on Criminal Justice Reform was doing with felonies. The second part is, what is the human toll of being classified as a misdemeanor? There's been quite a bit of research from both liberal and conservative think tanks. Just to read briefly from a recent paper, the consequences of these convictions are significant. In addition to the stigma of a criminal record, misdemeanors are often heavily fined or incarcerated and can lose jobs, housing, or educational opportunities. So these do have an impact beyond just the system. They have an impact on the individuals who are issued the citations and brought before the courts. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. John Spear with Applied Research Services. John is well known throughout Georgia for his work in looking at statistics related to criminal justice. He's worked with Department of Corrections. He did a lot of the number crunching for the Special Counsel on Criminal Justice Reform from different aspects. He's also helped the courts with the Jury Reform Act of 2011, and he's provided the methodology we use for compiling our state jury lists. John has received data from 3 courts that have traffic jurisdiction: the State of Atlanta Municipal Court, the State Court of Douglas County, and the Probate Court of Dooley County. And John, what I'd like you to do, if you don't mind, is just to kind of characterize what you've seen for a couple of minutes in terms, we've looked at bind-overs, we've looked at some other things, but if you can tell us about the data and your analysis, and then we'll kind of go through the slides. Would that work?
John, thank you for coming today. We appreciate it. You've got a vast amount of experience in this, and we'll listen with bated breath as to what your conclusions are from the data.
Traffic is sort of new. I used to felons more than I am misdemeanor in traffic. So, yes, we got 3 data sources that were mentioned. All were quite different in terms of obviously their volume, as well as the other cases they received. We particularly we got Atlanta first. Dooley came in last as a probate court, and the hardest part of the project is that we just didn't have consistent measures across all 3 information systems. So that was the hardest part. So although we'd love to show you consistently from one to the next, that sometimes the data is just not available for that. Overall, and I think the police officer, the chief, and them have testified, most everyone will get in and do bond forfeiture and pretty quickly. I mean, that was almost a dead-end stat. I heard when he said 57%, 55, 45. That's across the board. That rings pretty consistently across all the 3 jurisdictions. And then when you move on down from, and my take on it even taking DUI out. And I was very careful about that because our committee was warned against that, not making sure I commingle a DUI with a lane change when really giving the appearance that a lane change was something we were treating and pushing through the system when in reality it was a DUI. So we did correct for those sort of things. Most of the cases, I mean, let's take the fine-only state court proposal, which is the one that's traffic, but most of those cases, and they said will get handled, and they were correct. I find that about 99–98% of those fine-only cases that are on the table at this point will somehow or another get disposed, most of which will be bond forfeiture, fines, dismissal for some reason or another. Usually the dismissals I've been seeing are for pretrial, what they call pretrial in the records. So what that means is the court will say, come back and show me your taillights fixed, or show me your insurance, and then I'll just drop the case. We get a lot of that. And the case, it progressively starts moving until you get down to the last 3% or 2%. And the smaller jurisdictions, Douglas, they only get, believe it or not, and you'll see there, and they verified that for me, they only get about 30 bindovers from Douglas Municipal Court into the state court. Dooley, unless they have a data record problem, I can only find a handful of actual bindovers to Superior Court, because that's their next jurisdiction if you were to request a bindover. Atlanta, on the other hand, a little bit differently. They, obviously by volume, you're going to have more bindovers. Anecdotally, we think the 3,500 people is actually low for any 1 year. Now you're thinking, and by the way, I screened out DUI, and I even took the fine-only cases, that group of fines, and even took only one charge with a fine-only case in the city of Atlanta. Big volume, high volume case. You could still see not thousands, but hundreds and hundreds still pushing the system to the limits in terms of, and I don't know exactly how many continuances, but I will see bindovers even on fine-only type that are under consideration when there are no other citations involved. I mean, it's a single person, one citation, one fine only, and I see 387 people pushing for bindover over to Fulton County State Court. You know, that's not a lot in the big picture when you're looking at 100 and some odd thousand citations, but it is 300 bodies that has to be processed. So when you get these high volume courts, you will start seeing. And what did we did find about bindovers is interesting, and it doesn't surprise probably anyone in this room, is that the time to disposition for a bindover in generally, particularly in Atlanta, is how it's used. I'm not going to pass on how I think why they're doing it, but the time to disposition clearly delays and drags it down to the point where it's almost the same amount of time to get to final disposition if they were to dispose it of at municipal court, and sometimes twice as long just to make a decision to reach bindover for fine-only cases even, and even non-DUI or non-reckless driving cases in what I call your most of your volume of traffic is pretty much speeding, traffic, failure to obey controlled devices and things like that. You'll still see them pushing for a bindover in a small segment. But the chiefs are right. Most of them do go to bond forfeiture. Most people do pay. When you get into the question comes up a lot about the use of jail, probation. They are used in a very fine set of cases. I didn't know actually, and I think this is still correct, the Municipal Court of Atlanta can dispose of a DUI. I think that's correct. Yeah, so you'll see them quite a bit. We'll be maybe using those types of options for those cases. But overall, it seems if you look at where I call this the congestion or the pushing through, it seems to be clearly not just in volume because municipal courts are big, but just as a percentage, much greater, more likely in a place like the city of Atlanta. Now, it might be different in Gwinnett if I had the Gwinnett data or the DeKalb data or the DeKalb data. It was interesting in Douglas, and I talked to them personally over there. They get 30 bindovers out of Douglas Municipal Court a year. Maybe. I think this year and that's a high number. I think this year we're already up to like 20 there. So they don't get anything coming out of Douglas Municipal Court to state court. And then clearly Dooley, given they handle everything there in probate court, they are, again, they bind over very little. So it's, when you look at the citations in general, when you go to the fine only, obviously they account for a much smaller percentage of the case citations. They account for a much smaller percentage, if hardly any, at least in the smaller courts, of any bindovers. Most go all the way to paying fines. And if they are dismissed, there's usually a legitimate reason for dismissal, such as they show proof of evidence or documentation, or they show their light was fixed, or whatever it may be. And only 1 or 2% actually. I mean, in the smaller courts, that literally we're down into dozens. Might push past to get in front of a judge. So I know that's sort of a lot to sort of shoot at you at once. There's tons of other information available for you if you'd like to hear it. If you have any questions, we come along. But anything that comes to mind?
Questions for John? Chairman Golick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What I'm hearing, what I think I'm hearing, is that of these random traffic cases, I'll call them, other than DUI, less than 3% of those are getting bound over to the jury court of jurisdiction, whatever that is. It could be Superior Court in the more rural areas where you don't have a state court, or it could be like we have in Cobb. Let's say someone gets stopped in the city of Smyrna, they want a jury trial, they're going to go to Cobb County State Court, right? What I'm wondering is, of that number, and it's a pretty small percentage, so I'm trying to see where the crisis is, if any. I don't see any yet. Let's say it's 2%. Of that 2%, those are getting bound over to Judge Darden's court in Cobb, and that's another file for the calendar clerk and for the solicitor, for Judge Darden's calendar clerk and for the solicitor assigned to his courtroom. But that's not necessarily eating up court time. I mean, it's on a list, and it's on a calendar somewhere along with hundreds of others. But it's not really eating into that court time. What I'm interested in knowing, and you may have it, you may not, is of that small percentage, what percentage is actually eating into Judge Darden's court time? You know, what percentage of those cases generally, understanding that it's different in Dooley County and Douglas County and Cobb County, are really getting into jury trials and he's having to go ahead and strike a jury on a red light, you know, on a red light case? That generally, can you speak to that from a statistical standpoint? And if you can't, I understand. I didn't
Douglas County,
prepare you for that.
It gets to be about 100, right? And I actually moved them and was able to find out where they occurred and where the case was disposed of.
Yeah.
Well, a lot will appear to be on trial day, but they never make it to the judge.
Right.
They'll drop right when they get in there. But to actually get a verdict is less than 100. But that includes a lot of other cases that you would expect to get heard in state court, which would include DUI, and some more serious, not just this fine-only group that's being discussed. So you're right, not many, even in a case like that, are getting pushed forward to actually making it to it. But they are. If you look at, say, Douglas, for example, they'll skip over arraignment, they'll skip pretrial, they'll go to pretrial, and they'll just keep pushing like they want a trial, then they'll go pretrial. Now, I agree, they're not in front of a judge yet, and they will just keep pushing right up to the last day, and then they'll drop the fine and pay and bail out, and then only a small percent will actually try, a very small percent.
And I guess there's no way to empirically measure that, but I see that as just buying time to negotiate with the solicitor and or to come up with a fine, the fine money. Is that a reasonable, or is that a question better for the judges rather than you?
I think that's anecdotally what they have shared with us. I think a lot of it has been shared to me that they're either tracking paperwork down, they're trying to prove they have documentation as necessary, they're trying to prove they have insurance. They're trying to find the money, and so sometimes how the clerk...
Or they're trying to wear down the solicitor.
Yeah, they're trying to wear down the solicitor, but when it gets
No,
down
seriously,
to...
I mean, that,
unfortunately, the ones who are purposely trying to wear the solicitor down, there's not a code for that, like aggravation versus this is a legitimate person who had no money, and I gave him time to get money, and I can't parse those two.
And yet it's a very practical example of what actually occurs.
And it's a very practical example, and so we're probably seing both. I mean, I'm sure we could pull a solicitor.
I know there's no way to measure that, but I have to think.
I mean, it would take forever and to figure that out, but I was quite surprised at how many cases but they do kind of, even if it's 100 or 50 or 30, for any one court, it's not a big burden. But when you start adding it up, and I made this, and just disagree or just not disagree with this, I mean, is that when you add it up across all state courts, all municipal courts, the cumulative effect of it all, even pushing the paper, keeping it on record, can have sort of in the long term some effect at all in terms of how they process this. But a lot of them already, and that was a great percent, it was around 45, 55, 60, I've seen as high as 75, are forfeiting their bond immediately to move on and get out of the case.
One other question, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if you had the opportunity to see this, but is there anything, to your knowledge, again, this may be a question better for the judges, that from the prepay standpoint, the ability, and I think Mr. Caccaro might have touched on it, the ability to, if we're really focused on streamlining, driving efficiencies and effectiveness in our lower courts, there's nothing that I see statutorily, I hope to be corrected, that would prevent a state court from, as opposed to having hundreds of people coming into Cobb County State Court to pay a fine, why not just go online if they're going to come in and plead guilty anyway? I wonder if there are some constitutional issues that may come along with that in terms of, well, I'll ask that question of the judges, but there's nothing that you see that so far that would preclude a lot of this being done electronically if they were
I'm not a lawyer legally,
so minded.
Statutorily, but in
Right.
terms of volume,
Mm-hmm.
when you get a ticket, from experience, you see appear in court.
But if under a TVB scenario,
Right.
that's handled differently.
That'd be handled differently, right? I wouldn't get an arraignment date, and I know that
And so that goes to the issue of does that jurisdiction have a TVB or not? Does it choose to do that or not? Correct?
that would have to be something.
Actually, there are many jurisdictions that already offer online payments that do
Okay.
not have a court-ordered traffic
Okay.
violations bureau. One of the things that we've seen in terms of doing things electronically, several states have gone to a central citations processing. So they'll actually do that on behalf of the local jurisdictions, which allows somebody who may be at one end of the state to handle resolving their fine in another part of the state without having to drive. So that's one of the benefits of online bond forfeiture. There are some issues that not everyone has a TVB, but there's a lot of questions about administrative processing that the Prosecuting Attorney's Council, Council of State Court Judges, and the AOC are looking at. Again, that's a knot that involves constitutional rights, best processing mechanisms, things like that. But we do have the rudiments in Georgia of things like that. We have the AOC and the Georgia State Patrol have been working on an e-citation system to help the patrolmen get their citations to the correct court electronically, as opposed to having them dropped off every couple of weeks when somebody happens to circle around that courthouse or that solicitor's office.
Are you in a position to talk to the legal issues that potentially surround? I mean, if you're talking about somebody voluntarily, look, I don't want to go, I don't want to go to Cobb County, traffic court. I want to point, click, give them a credit card number, and the two hassles are, of course, the fine. I think the as great a hassle, if not greater hassle, is the necessity to spend potentially hours, plural, sitting there before you have the privilege of paying that rather large fine. And so, are you in a position, Mr. Carr, to talk to the fundamentals and any potential problems in the point and click pay or fine scenario, as opposed to dragging people into traffic court?
Might ask Chuck
Or should I
Stamos
wait-
to
or
help
should we
me out
wait
with
on
this
that?
one. But from what my understanding is, there is no clear statutory authority for providing online payments, but it is, again, as a customer service thing, it's been very popular. I was actually going through a couple of websites last night that different courts use throughout the state. I looked at Dooley counties. They use a vendor who's actually serves quite a few of the courts in Georgia. I would say that the list is at least 40 or 50 courts long that this one vendor serves. So.
Dooley, of all the courts that had the highest bond forfeiture and rapid, in other words, came up right off the bat and didn't keep moving down the system, Dooley was on the top of the list of taking money, taking it fast.
I think they would. I think they'd probably appreciate the word collecting. But I don't speak for the Dooley County Commission. We just.
Right. So,
Okay.
yeah, it's being done now, and I think there's no prohibition, but
Yeah.
in conversations that we've had, we think that maybe some express authorization in statute, perhaps with some standards for how those are administered, would be beneficial. And that's wrapped up in our discussions about traffic violations bureaus and administrative processing.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr.
Yes,
Chairman.
Any other questions for John? John, I have one. Just going back to your chart here on the bindovers. These are all traffic violations without DUIs, correct? That's what it says here.
On the fine only?
Yeah.
Yes, that is no DUI.
Okay.
Minimized of a related DUI if there happened to be one involved.
Okay.
A traffic light out that then goes with.
So these numbers would correlate to the proposal that's being made today in terms of the violations that would be proposed. Is that right? So it's been scrubbed so that the confusion here is all traffic violations as opposed to fine only type thing. I mean, these are all fine only traffic violations.
Actually, I want to be clear. On the right-hand side, the column of 3,500 compared to 30 compared to 15 is all. That's everybody, and then it's up there as well, John. But no, I think this is all traffic as the headline, as the title points out. And again, this is to give a high-level view, total volume. We're going to get down to. Why don't we just go down to this next?
I'm just trying to relate
yeah.
your proposal to what the data says.
Right, and
that's all I'm trying to do.
The proposal is, and again, it centers around the proposal by the Council of State Court Judges to reduce about 25 offenses, which are equipment or non-moving violations, to fine-only offenses. The reason being 25 is the judges, the prosecutors, the stakeholders involved, again, recognizing through the process that we've been through how complex this is, think that taking a first swipe at minor offenses, and again, to see what happens in terms of compliance, in terms of people paying their fines, impact on public safety. They'd like to see that with a small group of the least serious offenses and track that to see what the effect is, and to come back and, is it worth re-examining, or is this, a non-starter for Georgia? But this is the proposal is that the 25 offenses would be a first step, and that we would study what the effect is. Again, this next slide here. And John,
Hold on a second. Let me recognize Chairman Golick again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Caro, just to follow up on that point, if just trying to take a look at it from 35,000 feet, if greater than 97% of all traffic is getting, if all those cases, greater than 97% of those cases are getting closed, fine only, just as we think about it. It's not getting bound over. There's no jury trial. If that's already occurring, rather than declassifying, and those are including offenses that, running a red light technically is a criminal misdemeanor, punishable by up to $1,000 fine and a year in jail. That doesn't happen, but technically under our code it does. If we're expediting more than 97% of those cases in a fine-only situation anyway, what's the utility of declassifying some of those violations, probably starting with equipment?
Right.
What's the utility of doing that rather than simply making it a more efficient system on the front end under the electronic scenario that we've talked about? Point, click, you don't have to go to court. Why not pursue that track as opposed to getting into the declassification of it? I'm just wondering, in that scenario, if we can go ahead and bring technology in, so those people want to point and click, pay their fine, not have to drag up to the Marietta courthouse, why not do that rather than declassifying? Doesn't that get us in a more efficient manner to what we're I think, what we're trying to drive toward, which is a more efficient, effective system, et cetera. Am I making sense?
You are, and there's an answer.
Okay.
And the answer is that, first of all, even though, as that slide showed, you know, the Dooley County probate court, the state court of Douglas County, doesn't have a major flow of bindovers. That would be from Douglas Municipal Court to Douglas County State Court. The 3,500, and that's bodies. That's not just offenses, and that is about 8,000. What you're talking about is that's court resources. That's fines are flowing to a different jurisdiction, and again, there are people who are using that, and I think Judge Jackson actually could talk about and has talked about a little bit of how people use that as a tactic. So instead of actually, you know, wanting a jury trial to dispute the facts of a case, they're using it to delay the final resolution of a case. For Judge Jackson, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are certain offenses in the Teen Driving Act that where it matters what age you are at the time of disposition. So if you can push the time of disposition until you reach the age of 21, you have avoided some of the consequences.
If you're 19 years old and you're facing a 4-point suspension, a 4-point offense speeding at that level, or you're under 18 and you're about to accumulate 4 points, you're in the city of Atlanta and Fulton County and you ask for a jury trial, you will get to 21 or you'll get to 18 long before those times click in, and you will have completely thwarted the General Assembly's intent of dealing with that underage driver with a very serious type offense. And it's exactly why those things are being used, and they're being delayed to completely get around the mandatory suspension, notwithstanding the Senate Bill 248 limited for what we can now give over the last 24 months.
Right.
That is exactly why they're being used. And it may be that Atlanta is the only problem where this massive bindover problem, 3,500 bodies representing 8,000 cases. We did not have that problem 5 years ago when we had our own city court with jury trials.
Judge and Mr. Gaccaro, that really goes to the issue of, well, should these cases be resolved based upon the date of disposition as opposed to the date of the violation? That's a separate and separately disturbing issue in and of itself.
Well, and that's just one example of why bindovers matter. Judge Rodatus, who was the chief judge of the Gwinnett Recorder's Court for 5 years, said that during his tenure he saw thousands of cases where the request for a jury trial was used as a tactic. So it's not just
it's a manipulation, is what it is.
It's a manipulation, and again, take a first swipe, examine what the impact is for these offenses that, again, judges, a number of, again, the stakeholder community have looked at and said, here's one that is not going to affect the revenue aspects, is not going to, in terms of public safety. Again, there are, in the state court judge's proposal, which everyone is focusing on, there are seriousness triggers. So for instance, if the fine-only offense is coupled with another offense, there are triggers to show basically the severity of the crime, the risk to public safety. So that is one reason. Okay, the second reason is that part of the impetus for looking at reclassifying misdemeanors, and it was decriminalization originally, and again, that's off the table, but the second reason is labeling people as misdemeanors and what they call the collateral consequences. And that's something that our system doesn't have the data to track, but there are several national studies, papers that talk about the fact that when you're labeled a misdemeanor, there are consequences to somebody's life going forward. And we had a representative of the County Municipal Probation Advisory Council came and said that from his perspective, judges do see people who come before the judge and say, okay, I can pay the fine amount, the fees and the surcharges, and even the probation fees, but once they reach private or the county municipal probation, as a result of their problems with the court, perhaps they've had their license suspended under some mandatory provision, but they've lost their job, and even though At the time they went before the court, they could pay. By the time they reach probation, or while they're on probation, they're unable to pay. So there are consequences to being a misdemeanor. And that's, again, one of the reasons why this study proposal was initiated.
I can partially understand that, Mr. Chairman. I'll finish up with this, that every job application that I've ever seen, and this is anecdotal, I mean, it's, have you ever been convicted other than traffic? And I assume, suspended license comes under that, but I don't see the scarlet letter factor in any sort of traffic, situation. I don't want a felony, of course, but not under, so I don't see that as a driver as to on public policy there, but that's just my opinion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Powell.
I have two questions / comments dealing with the number of bind-over cases. It would appear to me that the number is probably misleading from the standpoint of if it's used as a negotiating tactic, and judges are perhaps under some pressure from their governing authority to try to keep the revenues in that jurisdiction. They know that bind-over threat or the demand of jury trial exists, and so sometimes I would presume that a defendant would say, if you will reduce this, or if you will change the sentence, or if you will do this, then I will pay that. Otherwise, I'm going to demand a jury trial. So that is a negotiating tactic that it doesn't reflect in these statistics that, 3,500 cases, there might be another 3,500 or 5,000 that were settled because of the threat that I am going to bind it over if you don't cut me a deal. Would that be an accurate assessment?
I would say that the data would not be reflected in the records that were sent to
But it does happen.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
I knew the answer. I just wanted I wanted validation.
Reduce my DUI to reckless, or I'll ask for a jury trial, and the fine money disappears from your jurisdiction.
Right.
And I'm going to tie up your officers for 3 days at trial.
Right.
Yes.
The second comment, and I would ask if y'all had discussed it, because I have mixed emotions. If I plead guilty, or if I do a bond forfeiture, and I've been involved in a traffic accident that is going to result in some kind of civil litigation, then that is negligence per se, and I don't want to do that. My insurance company doesn't want me to do that, and so what I do is either I bind it over, or I just get a unending degree of continuances till after the civil litigation is resolved, which still ties up in the court, whether it's in the original court or in another court, because I don't want to hamstring my defense in civil litigation. And since that's happening anyway, has there been any discussion as far as addressing the issue of negligence per se, so that if we want to resolve these issues sooner rather than later, is just to take the admission aspect of a conviction, a plea, a bond forfeiture out of the mix, to also help prevent some of these either bindovers or endless delays that clog up and keep these cases going.
That has been discussed. The statute, again, relating to bond forfeiture, and I'm going to paraphrase, I think you know it better than I do, but what that does is say that if you do forfeit your bond, that for purposes of a civil case, that can be treated as an admission. We've talked with, at least among staff, about trying to, another problem with bond forfeiture is a lot of people don't understand what it is as a mechanism. So, and that's in the court system, let alone the layman or the average citizen. So that is something that we're looking at. Is there a way of treating it as a type of plea besides a nolo, or again, the question of whether it is truly an admission? Because again, this is online payment and bond forfeiture is essentially a bulk system. And I can tell you, I'm at least one person who has just used that mechanism just to get it over with. So.
Well, it is, but at the same time, only the uninitiated or the uninformed who are at potential civil risk are going to forfeit a bond or enter a plea or,
Yes, sir.
even though they want to go ahead and get it over with.
Mm-hmm.
If those cases are being postponed so that they cannot be used as admissions in civil litigation anyway, why not just recognize that and take out the civil admission aspect of it and just recognize that and promote the efficient resolution of these cases? I mean, I know the trial bar would probably have an issue, at least the plaintiff's bar would, probably not the defense bar. But, I mean, if it's happening anyway and it's not getting utilized except by the people who inadvertently do something, I mean, why not just go ahead and recognize that and take that aspect of it out so that that does not clog the courts as well?
Yes. That is, again, something that we have worked on. We don't have any silver bullet yet.
Okay, why don't you continue on?
Sure. The rest of these I'll run through fairly quickly. I think the chiefs pointed out that there are some best practices that are used in some local jurisdictions that may not have penetrated through the system. The judges, in discussing this, and they may comment on this later as a panel, but find that there are several best practices that we could try and push through the system with better education of court administrators, judges, what options are allowed, and also the education and training of citizens to make more information available about what their rights are, what their responsibilities are when they're issued a traffic citation. Second, overall, promote is kind of a wishy-washy word, but in our discussions, solicitors and public defenders in traffic court help move cases. They improve the chance that somebody's going to feel like they've had a fair shake. And so that's, again, in the draft proposal that you have, we've gone through a little bit further and included at least the mention of a bill that the probate court judges are going to ask for this year to help them working with either the district attorney or solicitor's office to have a prosecuting attorney available when they're holding a traffic court.
Can I interrupt at this point?
Sure. You just push a button. There you go.
Okay.
Chairman Powell.
I mean, if that's already been done for municipal courts, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Allowing them to use solicitors?
Yes, it has.
Okay. And the probate courts are now asking for that same acknowledgement?
Yes.
Okay.
And it's virtually the same bill.
Are there any other traffic courts that do not have that if we're going ahead and recognizing that this promotes it, why do we have to wait till somebody comes in and asks for it? Why don't we just go ahead and deal with it in the probate court bill if there are any other traffic courts out there? Are there?
No, that covers us, because the municipal court would take care of the recorder's courts as well. Chuck probably worked a lot harder on that legislation than I did. But
we solved a lot of the problems in the municipal courts and recorder's courts with 352 last year. The probate bill was a little more complicated because you talk about concurrent jurisdiction with the district attorney. We're working on some detail now that should resolve that, and that would take care of all of the courts.
All right, so, I mean, magistrate courts aren't doing
They
this,
don't do traffic,
so nobody else?
No, sir. If they
Okay.
do it, they do it by designation, and then the authority from those statutes travels with that designation.
Okay, so this will give every court
Yes.
the resource of that.
the option, it's
The
with
access.
the consent of the local governing authority.
Yeah, somebody's got to pay for it, but otherwise it works.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
The next proposal, give judges and prosecutors more tools to encourage and compel satisfaction of judgment and payments of fines and fees. We've talked at length about the tax intercept proposal. There's a draft that's been, I believe, drafted by ACCG, and there's plenty of supporting documentation before that, so I won't dwell on that, but consistently that's been a fairly popular proposal. Encouraging prepayment of fines and fees. I just took a header from the city of Norcross. It's easy, it's fast, and it's secure.
Happen to represent that area, by the way, as a matter of fact. That's a good word. Thank you for using their logo.
Anytime, that's the president of the Council of Municipal Court Judges is the municipal judge from the city of Norcross. So he's been very involved, although he always has a calendar when you call a meeting, so he hasn't been able to be here. The last proposal, and this is something that, as complex as the traffic courts are and traffic offenses are, traffic violations bureaus is extremely complicated, and I think it's fallen to the prosecutors and the courts to really try and unpack what that means. There's been court cases and that have cast doubt on whether parts of it are constitutional, but the original reason that violations bureaus were established was to provide for administrative handling of the most minor traffic offenses. The Supreme Court held, even when it was ruling part of it unconstitutional, that the General Assembly intended the traffic violations bureaus to promote the speedy and efficient administration of these cases. So trying to update this, put it on sounder constitutional footing is something that we are still endeavoring to do.
Okay.
This would also include the examination of bond forfeiture, like Chairman Powell had suggested. Those are the proposals. We provided the committee with a fuller document. We are going to expand that and include documentation to go with that. Again, Dr. Spear has been working very hard. Unfortunately, he's been called to testify a lot on some of our other work, but we plan to have some more information about how far our cases penetrate into courts. You see some of the data on fine amounts that you requested last time that we were able to provide in those 3 courts. So at that point, I believe that you had wanted to invite the judges and prosecutors to comment or to...
Yeah, I think what I'd like to do is to make sure we understand this document, which is the draft traffic proposal reform.
Yes, sir.
Make sure we understand this in specifics. And let's invite the judges up for one more time before Christmas. We are going to hold another hearing on the 26th, by the way. I just thought you'd like to know that. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Yeah, we're good.
Everybody will be out. I would like to extend the apologies from the Council of Probate Court Judges and from Judge Wickham and the Council of Municipal Court Judges who couldn't make it today.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you so much. John, just let me make sure that the list of fine-only offenses I see here is what you actually put the data together for. Pardon?
But the label says fine only. It refers to that list.
It's this list. Okay, good. All right. Just want to make sure the data is consistent. All right. Do you have any opening comments on this, guys, or you just want to take some questions?
Yeah, I'm ready for questions. I will, my name is Jim Anderson. I'm the president-elect of the Municipal Court Judges Council. I do want to let you know that as we have been walking through this process, there has been a gratifying...
Bring the microphone over a little bit there.
A gratifying and emerging consensus among all the classes of courts that have been participating in this. I think we've been getting along very well and have come up with a document that didn't require a whole lot of rancor or disagreement. And so you have what truly is, I believe, a representative consensus of what the judges that are affected by this really believe should happen, if you're going to do anything at all.
Okay. If we're going to do anything at all?
Yes.
Okay. All right. That may be entirely what we do. Okay. Do we have any questions for these august judges? Chairman Goley.
If you would, I appreciate your being here. If you could speak to the question I had before about the, we're trying to drive efficiencies and effectiveness. If 3% of the, less than 3% of the cases are really getting bound over, that would seem to me to be not a huge issue, although you certainly don't want to see abuses in the system and manipulations. If our goal is this efficiency in the court system, do we do well to go ahead and, I don't know if promote's the right word, but there's nothing preventing court systems right now from the point-and-click scenario in terms of disposing with traffic cases. And that goes to the issue, well, then why haven't jurisdictions that aren't, why aren't jurisdictions using that aren't using it right now, and any other issues that come to the fore as opposed to declassifying, because all those traffic cases, those include the equipment violations and random red light running and so forth. Can you speak to that?
I can. I've just got a couple of general comments, and I hate to say that I'm a little more confused now than I was before. And this may be my misunderstanding. Some of these statistics that we're talking about have to do with bindovers from municipal court to state court or superior if they don't have a state court. But from my personal experience, that's a very, very small number of the total cases that I handle. Because, say in Cobb County, if the ticket is written in unincorporated Cobb County, it's coming to my court. It's not going to go through municipal court. So the bindovers from municipal court, that's 3% of the cases that I see.
It's going to Division II traffic court.
But it comes to state court.
Right, and it'll be disposed there, or
Right.
if it's bound over, then it's bound over to you or one of your colleagues, Division I, correct?
But I guess I'm drawing the distinction, which I think the statistics are naming, which is the bindovers from municipal court to a court that can hold jury trials.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Atlanta is a different animal, but in other counties, that's not a lot of cases that's not a high percentage of the number of cases that we see, because we get original jurisdiction cases from unincorporated Cobb County. So I may be misunderstanding the statistics, but if we're analyzing statistics that have to do with bindovers from municipal court into a jury court, I'll say, that doesn't include those cases which begin. Now, there may be municipal courts that have jurisdiction through probate court and that sort of thing. Probate court may have a bindover over the whole county or have original jurisdiction. So, I think those statistics need to be, there needs to be some distinction or clarification of that. I'm not trying to muddy things. I just want to make sure our numbers show what they're supposed to show.
Mr. Chairman, do you mind if I ask Mr. Spears if he wants to clarify that?
I was just going to do the same thing.
Okay.
Good. I'm going to take the microphone there, John.
So, again, there's a couple of things. Number one is the way that the case management system reports out things. But number two is you've got to look at the court that's reporting out. The City of Atlanta Municipal Court binds over to the State Court of Fulton County. 3,500 from the City of Atlanta, but there are 14 municipalities in Fulton County that send their bindovers to the State Court of Fulton County. While we're examining the municipal court, understand that the impact on the Fulton County State Court is not just Atlanta, but it's 14 different jurisdictions. Judge Anderson, your court is another one that would send things to state court. So all we're doing is looking at how many the City of Atlanta send to Fulton County, not what the full impact is on the State Court of Fulton County.
In the case of Douglas, which we called up to verify, they only have one municipal court, which is Douglas, the City of Douglas Municipal Court. They only bind over 25 cases a year to state court. So that would fit with your particular experience in your court.
Right. Very, very
It may
small.
just be that Atlanta is a unique situation. And oddly enough, the legislature recognized it as such up until 5 years ago when we had the City Court of Atlanta, which was a state court of limited jurisdiction. Strolay was our prosecutor. We actually had jury trials in the city of Atlanta, and then the legislature merged a court of record because its appeals went to the Court of Appeals down into a municipal court. Before, if somebody wanted a jury trial, I'd lean over to the clerk and say, send up a jury. And we'd have one right then and there. And we had no delay and no bind over. But now we don't have that. And there are 13 other cities, Johns Creek, Roswell, Sandy Springs, the other cities, Peachtree City, that feed into Fulton State. If we are the cause of the backlog and so on, one answer may be on a local situation, go back to the old city court of Atlanta and take those 3,500 cases out of Fulton State. You'll also change the composition.
Judge, you and I both know that's a much more complicated political matter than any of us at this table cares to deal with. But let me just redirect, if I could, redirect it back.
Our county may be unique in that we have so many feeder municipal courts that no other county has.
Unique in so many ways.
Or 3 counties.
Let me just, I'm just trying to get to the core of, if we declassify X number of offenses, most of which are equipment, or a large number from the AOC's proposal that are equipment violations or something of that ilk, I'm just wondering what the net effect of that really is on the system. My sense of it is that it's not a whole lot.
It will not have, my boots on the ground observation is it will not affect jury trials at all. Our data, for instance, from Douglas County from 2011, when we ran, I think, some statistics that you were asking about. 2011, they had 7,800 payable citations, 56 jury trial requests, and only 2 actual trials out of 7,800. So it'll be negligible. In terms of the jury trials, now, as you said, it may appear on a calendar, but it gets resolved. And so actual judge time, jury time, courtroom time, not very much.
We don't have, and we're not, Cobb's not special, and I'm sure that there are a lot of larger jurisdictions that don't have the point-and-click mechanism for expediting of what I'll call a routine traffic case that we're focused on. From a boots on the ground perspective, what's your sense on that? I realize you're not speaking on behalf of the Cobb County State Court. Just it's a dialogue and a study committee.
It is.
Wouldn't that go right to the issue of effectiveness and efficiency and streamlining and clearing cases and moving it right along?
But there are problems and there are hurdles, and one of them was addressed with the effect of somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. They just don't want to go to court. They click, they pay. Now they've admitted guilt.
It's not a knowing waiver?
Exactly.
Okay.
One of the other issues...
That's what I wanted to get to.
And by the way, there's a difference between the TVB issue where someone posts a bond, okay, and then later on that they don't show, and that's understood they're not going to show, and that bond becomes a fine payment. That's different from click and pay your fine online, okay? Because when you click and pay and you pay your fine online, you're intending to pay a fine. But the legal... transformation of a bond into a fine, that's problematic, and it always has been. We need to find a way to, how does that happen? You don't come to court and all of a sudden the bond you paid, which was to cover your appearance in court, gets forfeited. Your bond gets forfeited, and then it becomes a fine payment. Now that's sort of convenient and quick, but there's problems with that. So those are the kinds of issues that have to get addressed with the effort to find an efficient way for people to pay their fines, and remembering the distinction between bond forfeiture and paying your fine online. So those are things that we are working on that, to me, really are different from the issue of reclassification of traffic.
That goes to the bond forfeiture statute itself.
That's a big,
right?
that's a big nut.
Right.
That's going to take a lot of work to figure out how to do that, and in light of the decisions that called into question the constitutionality of the old traffic.
And in no way do we want to get into what will end up being a bunch of quicksand on knowing waiver and understanding that it's not like you're buying something from Amazon.com. I accept the terms of this agreement. I accept, and then you press continue, and your card is charged.
I would suggest
I get that.
Yeah, I would suggest you keep reclassification pushing forward, if that's what you want to do, and not bog it down with the issue of TVB reform and how we're going to do payment. That can be worked on, but it's a separate. It can be a separate issue, and I would suggest to you, if you marry those.
Right.
We're just beginning to start our meetings.
Right.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to address 2 quick points. I don't speak for the State Court of Fulton County, but I am a Fulton County magistrate part-time, and I do sit by designation in state court, and I see the cases that get bound over even from my own court in Sandy Springs. There are two reasons for bind over. One, the perception that you get a better deal in Fulton County, and you do. You get a better deal.
In state court.
In state court. Less fine on many cases. And second is the delay that Judge Jackson spoke so eloquently about in just a few minutes ago. But as far as being a drag on the state court of Fulton County, personally, I don't see it. I've tried one jury trial in a speeding case in Fulton County. Took all day, but it was a deputy sheriff that was caught speeding. and he did want a jury trial, and by golly, he got one. It took all day. Second point, and let me just follow up on what Judge Jordan had to say. You cannot plead guilty online.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot, in my opinion, pay a fine online, because a fine can only be imposed by a judge only after accepting a plea of guilty, no contest, or presiding over a conviction. And you cannot do that online. The only way you can pay online, even theoretically now, is under the aegis of the Traffic Violations Bureau, which is limited. The legislature has limited those cases upon which they will allow an online payment. And that is further limited by the order of the court, particularly Judge Jackson. And we started out not letting traffic accident cases do TVB, simply because of the fact we want to make sure there's insurance involved. We want the victim, if there is one, to have a say-so in sentencing. Lots of good reasons for that. So if you're talking about doing the efficiencies, that's fine. Don't, in my opinion, and I've got to echo what Judge Jordan has already said, don't marry those two together, because it's a completely different box.
No, we understand that from a substantive and legislative standpoint, but we just want to, this whole thing, of course, began with the recommendations of the Criminal Justice Reform Council and trying to promote efficiencies and effectiveness. When we get that, so we're looking at different, at different avenues, understanding that you don't want to go ahead and create a problem where there wasn't one, but where you can logically explore an avenue. You may not be able to get all the way down the avenue, but we probably have the responsibility to do so. And of course, when we first started, Mr. Chairman, part of the impetus was in a lot of the rural jurisdictions where we didn't have state courts. Right. There's in getting back to an issue we talked about really at our first meeting, is the fact that there's nothing precluding, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I reserve the right to be wrong, is that right now in rural jurisdictions where you don't have a state court, there's nothing preventing now this doesn't go to the DA's issues because they have their own issues, and I get that. But there's nothing preventing a Superior Court judge would otherwise use that, nothing precluding them from designating some other judge, provided they have they otherwise have the qualifications to be. They can designate them as an assisting Superior Court judge to handle those perhaps not as weighty cases and on the traffic side that would get bound up to Superior Court in those jurisdictions that don't have state courts. So from a Superior Court judge resource standpoint, that to me is already fixable if they want to designate another judge in that jurisdiction, provided they meet the qualifications of an assisting Superior Court judge, correct?
Yeah, that's one of those better practices.
Yeah.
That's what I read when I see that on the slide. That's one of the things I think about is circuit-wide state courts or using the Judicial Assistance Act to get these traffic cases cleared out of Superior Court quickly and efficiently so that they don't languish.
There is a looming question that would be particularly important for those rural jurisdictions that rely on part-time judges, because, as I understand, the JQC is revisiting the canons at this point and is considering a requirement that if you, as a part-time judge, serve one time, you may serve one time.
Yeah. They've changed it.
Is it 2 times?
Yeah, I'm on that JQC committee. That applies only to what we used to call pro-hacks with lawyers who were called in to serve. But if you're a part-time judge, it does not apply. You can serve as a part-time judge as an assisting judge without that number.
Well, I particularly have had to give up my entire practice in the state court of Fulton County, because if I sit there at all, I can't practice there.
Just to be clear, so there's nothing precluding even a part-time judge in a rural jurisdiction who otherwise meets the requirements to be an assisting Superior Court judge from sitting in those rural jurisdictions where there is no state court and hearing those cases. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
But be careful, because that, it hasn't made it to a final rule yet, and monitor that rulemaking process.
We think the Supreme Court will. We've sent the rules to, or are sending those new JQC rules to the Supreme Court. They'll be vetted there probably and ready to go this summer.
May
Okay.
I address your original question? If it's such a small problem, why do we need to do this? It seems to be, if we're doing 97% and there's so few of these equipment violations that actually make it to jury trial. No, they don't get to a jury trial. They age out before they get there. But when I'm sitting this morning, for example, and binding a seatbelt case over for a jury trial, we know it's not going to get there. We know it's fine only. Yes, I could even, and I've had this before, appoint someone as a public defender and then ask for a jury trial on an equipment only or fine only type case that's on this list. And you shake your head and said, that is incredibly inefficient. And you got 7 now where it's fine only. And that's a good start. And the list of equipment is a good start. And it may be 3%, but if it's 3,500, that's still a big number. And maybe this is a good way to start. And then look at the TVB later. We in our court, by the way, run our online as a TVB order to get around the problems that Judge Anderson's talking about. But the two are very closely related. But in our court, this is a huge number of people.
So it's your collective position, just to make sure we understand, that even though the overall number is less than 3% that actually gets up to that level, in some jurisdictions that number is going to be a lot larger. Therefore, if you can go ahead and save time and expense, including the possible appointment of defense counsel if necessary, by... No?
No, I think if it's a criminal case...
If you have a possibility of any jail time at all.
Right, that's what I mean.
Any jail.
Right.
That's where mine's different. On the 7, for example, the seatbelts, the HOV, the open container, the move over, and so on, it's fine only. But a number of lawyers and judges believe because it's a misdemeanor, they're still entitled to a public defender, although they won't. And at the moment of jury trial, even though they can't get jail. And the question becomes, if you make them a minor misdemeanor, they're not going to have a jury trial. It'll be fine only. But are they still going to be able to get a public defender? And that's a question that I frankly, it's below my pay grade. I think that's a state court, Superior Court judge's question to answer. I really don't know. I'm not sure.
Thank you.
On that issue, on page 2 of the recommendation you're making, you are saying that convert fine-only offenses into a new classification of criminal offense that would be effectively a minor misdemeanor that explicitly has no right to trial by jury.
What about public defenders, though?
Well, that's...
My public defenders have a significant caseload that deal with fine only and also equipment violence. They have a number of cases. We're lucky we have a full-time public defender staff. Many of these smaller courts do not.
Let me just follow. I'll get it right to you. On page 2, you also say that this is a little more specific. It says the following Title 40 offenses would become fine only. The maximum fine would remain at misdemeanor level of $1,000. Defendants would not be placed on probation while making payments towards the fine, but could be subject to post-sentencing court appearances with appropriate sanctions for failure to pay or perform community service as an alternative. Is that going to work?
Well, the ironic thing about that is that as it stands now, if probation is available and people need time to get to pay or work through the issues, how they're going to pay the fine, is it going to get converted to community service, those types of things. The people that are dealing with that now are probation officers. Probation is a user pay, it just is. It's that the users pay for being on probation. So on these offenses with this change and no probation, the people who are now in charge of massaging how that's going to get done and how that can get converted and what issues this offender is facing are now judges, and that is not user pay. So that is one of the things, the realities that this will do is that courts and judges will now have to deal with post-sentencing fulfillment if you will, of the fine. But
So,
yes,
so this recommendation then would incur more court
that is
time rather
I
than
would think
less?
that's going to be a hidden expense and a hidden time. Is that when and I talked about this the last time we came, that none of us have a real desire for incarceration on these issues. That's not what we care about. What we care about is the benefits of probation, where we have POs who can meet with the folks, work on getting their fines paid, converting it to community service, and the other, of course, that we lose is the ability to control someone's behavior post-sentence. This is the example I used last time of the 21-year-old with the 5th speeding ticket. I can put her on probation, and I'm going to see that she doesn't speed for the next 6 months or a year. With no probation, she speeds that night. There's nothing I can do about it. So those are the issues that you lose when you take away probation, and I understand there is a decision for the legislators to decide of this thing that Mike talked about. You balance that against this idea that you're stigmatizing people by saying that they got an offense which could have been punished by incarceration. So that's a legislative decision. There's going to be losses and there's going to be gains. So I would say one last thing on that. I want to get back to the question you asked, Mr. Chairman. Convert current fine-only offenses into a new classification of criminal offense that would be effectively a minor misdemeanor. And then if you look at the last line, it says the following Title 40 offenses would become fine-only. It talks about maximum fine. That's not really the same thing, because what we have all been working on are maximum fines for certain offenses. I don't know that there's been a great, all this time, discussion and consensus of giving them a new name, making them a different level. We really have just been talking about what is the maximum punishment going to be. So I don't know that that's necessarily a true consensus that we've agreed that we should give these offenses a new name. I'd call them minor misdemeanors. There's all sorts of drafting problems with that in the code. Do you know how many times misdemeanor is used in the code? Each time we have to go back and say, well, do you mean misdemeanor or do you mean minor misdemeanor? All those types of things. Really, our hard work and collaboration has been on the issue of maximum punishment. So there's a slight difference there. I want to make sure that you understand that may come out in the drafting.
Thank you, Chairman Powell.
As to the issue of indigent defense, that this minor misdemeanor, and Mike, I may ask you this, but the recommendation is, but could be subject to post-sentencing court appearances with appropriate sanctions for failure to pay or perform community service as an alternative. Would that include contempt and possible jail? And if that's the case, then I think that answers your question. You've got to provide counsel. Whether it's that or in post-sentencing, the possibility of incarceration.
Any possibility.
That's the rule. I agree. I don't know, we may not be saving a whole lot in that area.
You agree, Mike?
I will defer to the judges.
Okay.
I think you're right.
Other questions for our panel? I've got one that goes ahead and it actually goes back in the document that this is on page 2 again. It says the judges in third paragraph, the judges and prosecutors have identified a small number of traffic misdemeanors that warrant increased penalties. The overall goal is to enhance public safety. Not only could the enhanced penalties serve to put the public on notice of the severity of the offenses, but new sentence lengths would give prosecutors and judges the ability to sentence an offender to sufficient time to complete DUI court program. Strengthening the flexibility of the system to use pretrial diversion to rehabilitate a program would benefit both the offender who has been identified with a problem and would result in safer roads for Georgians. You want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Okay. What we've done is identified, I believe there's 7 at this point. Oh, okay, the second and 5 was added. So 7 offenses which have been discussed on page 4, set forth on page 4, that these would remain misdemeanors, but have the same name, but would have an enhanced confinement of 24 months, maximum fine of $5,000. What's happening, and I think we talked about this 1 or 2 meetings ago, is that The other way that that's being addressed that's unofficial is the stacking issue, where we're stacking, offenses are stacking to try to get to 24 months. And this is sort of a recognition that not only from a public safety standpoint, that some offenses may well, from a legislative standpoint, have the opportunity or the discretion to sentence up to 24 months, but it also, to some degree, addresses this the issue of stacking and wanting somebody who has been racing, homicide by vehicle second degree, a recognition that person's, again, not that they would be in custody for 24 months, they might be, but if they're not in custody for the full 24 months, they'll be on probation, and their behavior will be restricted and supervised by the court. So that's part of that discussion. It really is something that, it's a legislative call, but we're putting it out there to see if the legislature is interested in that. But it also recognizes this whole stacking issue that may be at least reduced by going ahead and saying on the serious offenses, maybe 24 months would be sufficient.
Do we know of other states who do that?
I don't know that.
You want to comment on that, Chuck?
I don't have it with me, but we do have some statistical data we did last year. There's a significant number. I want to say there's in excess of like 15 or 16 states that do misdemeanors that are more than 12 months and have classes of misdemeanors. I will say that where the prosecutors, as a general rule, have supported the concept. We also acknowledge it's very complicated with our statutory scheme. There's a lot of places we got to go into the code to deal with current definitions of felony versus misdemeanor, and it is fraught with peril. So,
fraught with peril.
We have aggravated misdemeanors now. We have aggravated misdemeanors, aggressive driving, second driving, suspended license within 5 years, where the punishment's still 12 months, but the fine can be as high as $2,500. So we have different classes of misdemeanors already, and they exist in the code. They're rare, but we do see them.
Well, yeah, just where did the 24 months and the maximum fine of $5,000 come from? Is that, what's the basis for that?
Well, I think the 24 months came because if you had a third and 10 DUI with a lane change, that person could get 24
because of the stacking.
Right.
That's what the output of the stacking thing
That's exactly
normally comes to, something in that range.
Yeah, and I think otherwise it's just something on paper for the legislators to consider.
Okay.
So
That's what the DUI courts say
Right.
they need 24 months to effectively deal with the person with their second offense.
Okay.
Particularly with the ignition interlock, they can't get any type of permit until X number of months goes by. And if you only have 12 months, by the time that period expires, the case is aged out. So the court cannot legally monitor, and there's a lot of interplay between the time you get a license and the time the ignition interlock under the current system works. That seems to be one of the major reasons to get that 24 months in.
Okay. I'm just kind of rolling through this
Sure.
document here and just trying to get a little more understanding. You're recommending on page 5 the use of solicitors and public defenders and traffic courts to facilitate movement of cases, procedural fairness, and so on. You say it was an extremely helpful step forward for municipal courts as they work to further professionalism in their courts. Well, I understand professionalism, but, you know, what's the real benefit of this?
I can give you again, I'm also a municipal court judge, so we have public defenders who come in, and what will happen is the prosecutor will be negotiating the case, and the defendant doesn't understand the negotiations. And the prosecutor, it's probably a pretty good resolution, but they don't understand it. And the public defender will come in and say, well, here's what they're really saying, here's the effect of it, here's the effect it'll have on your license. Prosecutor can't really go into all that. They're on the other side of the case. So the way it's efficient is the defendants are more fully informed about what the offer might be, what the consequences might be of taking that offer or of not taking that offer, those kinds of things. So that is an efficiency that is achieved with the public defenders. Also, there are There are cases in which they're more serious, like say 3rd and 10. Let's say a superior court will look at that, and some superior courts will say, if I look back in those prior offenses, a plea was entered on a prior offense and they were not represented by counsel, we won't acknowledge that as a prior offense. So that's another efficiency that's achieved. But primarily that the folks who have consequences in front of them are more informed and can make a better informed decision.
Okay. My concept of a public defender really goes to some higher class issues in terms of what they're engaged in. I mean, are there a group of public defenders who do traffic? I mean, is that where they do everything? I mean, I don't know.
We've hired a public defender who comes to court and advises the people who are charged with whatever offense they might have in municipal court. Could be an ordinance violation. I'll make that public defender available. So.
Okay.
There's ethical issues with the judges in courts that don't have either public defender or solicitors that are very problematic. We cannot give legal advice from the bench, so while we may see something that...
Make a terrible decision. Yeah.
We may see something that it has a clear legal impediment to prosecution right in front of our faces. And we have no prosecutor, we have no defense lawyer, so what do? And the defendant doesn't know what we know. We can't advise them what we know. In theory, we can't dismiss a case. We have no discretion to dismiss a case just as a matter of discretion.
Because it's weak.
You have the defendant that doesn't know how to make a motion to dismiss that would invoke our ability to make a legal decision. There's just all kinds of problems not dealing with pro se defendants and, by the way, prosecuting cases. You have no prosecutor. Comes to trial day. What do you tell? You have the police officer there. What do you question the police officer? How far do you question the police officer? If the police officer doesn't know to recite venue, do you prompt the police officer to tell you what venue was in effect at the time? Criminal courts work best where both sides are represented and the judge is calling the balls and strikes. So if you're talking about efficiency and professionalism and having a court function the way the public has a right to believe the court ought to function, put the staff in there to do it right. Now, I understand budgetary restraints and constraints. I do understand that. They're competing interests. But for the integrity of the system, I'd advocate strongly for defense and prosecution.
Okay.
That's about all my soapbox can handle for one day.
So that's a resource issue is what you're talking
It
about
is.
more than anything
Well,
else.
it's in some cases it's more than a resource issue. It gets deeper than that, but principally yes.
And this is a problem that interplays when they point, click, and pay. And a lot of it's anecdotal. Had someone with a limited DUI permit that paid an HOV case online. She never realized she suddenly lost her limited permit. Any conviction will do it. And fortunately, there was a way out for her, but for technical reasons. So you have to construct your point and click. You know, I understand I'm waiving my jury trial. You make an X there, and you actually do it. And they click all the things, the rights they're waiving. It's a much more complicated point and click. But that's what we're going to be looking at when we look at the TVB. And when that person's sitting there online with no lawyer and no judge, it can create a lot of problems. It's much harder to unwind something than it is to do it right in the first place. Fortunately, in that case, it was an easy out that we were able to see.
So the repercussions of click and pay basically could lead you to some other offense that really is you're going to get just suspended or whatever it's going to do. It's going to
Which is why
not what you want.
You can't click and pay if you're under 21. We had so many people 80 and 55 click and pay so mom and dad can't find out. Then they suddenly realize their license gets suspended. Along comes a lawyer, motion to set aside the judgment. I didn't know the collateral consequence of losing my license. I didn't realize I had a right to a jury trial. We had so many of those in Atlanta. We just decided, if you're under 21, you are coming to court. End of story in every case. And that eliminated much of the going back over that type of ground. And again, that may be a legislative decision that we look at in the TVB, that if you're under 21, you'll have to come to court. There are limited cases where you must come to court. The courts, by their own orders, can add to that, like accidents under 21, certain other offenses we pulled out. So again, there's a lot of moving parts in this. They all come together, but I would echo Judge Anderson. The court works best when there's lawyers on both sides. Keep the judge out of trouble, too.
Judge Jackson just pointed out one of the major flaws in the quote click and pay type system. If you've got to click, yes, I agree to waive my right to a trial by jury. You can't do it that way, because in order to waive a right to a trial by jury and enter a plea, the judge must make under the Constitution, must make the individual decision that the person's doing it willingly, knowingly, and voluntarily. And not only that, if you're on the other end of the computer, how do you even know it's the defendant? The defendant's rights to their trial is preserved under the TVB by virtue of the fact that they're posting a bond, and they still have the option to come to court. So there's no waiver of, it's not a plea on TVB. So that's, well, I don't want to keep repeating myself.
I think, if I may, one of the things that you find in other states is that they actually treat a lot of these things as petty offenses, infractions, things like that, that don't have quite the consequences that a misdemeanor would. And I know that our system is very complex with license suspensions, the teen driving laws, and that sort of thing. But there, in a lot of places, you know, a minor traffic offense or a misdemeanor here in Georgia would be like, in another state, it might be like an ordinance violation. So, I mean, they are very minor. They have less consequences to them. So the question is, if these, you know, stay crimes of the severity level that is a misdemeanor, even a minor misdemeanor, that's a difference between the way Georgia does it and many other states.
Okay, are there any other questions for our panel of judges or for Mike? I want to thank you for all the time you've put into this. And Chairman Golick and I met with you back in the summer, I think, and I think you guys have, you've memorized the verses to the song, and so I compliment you on that, because you've not wavered one bit, I don't think, from the time we actually started. Although this does appear to be a bit of a compromise in terms of allowing the process to move along if, in fact, the legislature figures out that there's more benefit to moving ahead with this not reclassification, but the fine-only offenses, and we'll have to decide that. And that's why a recommendation of this committee is going to be that we're going to authorize a higher per diem for the Judiciary Non-Civil Committee, because they'll have to spend a lot more time on this than anybody else. All right. Thank you, guys. We appreciate it. Wish you Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
We're going to hear from the ACCG and the GMA. You had a point back there? So, yeah, come on.
Make some comments.
Judge, yeah.
I'm with the Attorney General's office and wanted to follow up on some.
Sure, come on. You want to speak?
Yes.
Well, come on.
Be happy to.
Joe, just why don't you tell us who you are and what.
I'm Joseph Droley. I'm with the Attorney General's office, and in one of my past lives, I was the solicitor of the now defunct City Court of Atlanta, and litigated the issue of violation bureaus and whether or not you get a jury trial for traffic offenses in the state of Georgia. So I have some familiarity with this. I just wanted to comment and follow up on something that has been said by the judges, and I think that Chuck mentioned as well. When you're talking about creating new offenses, this is an area that I would just caution the committee that this is not something simple. For example, the 24-month idea that is a major change in the law. Right now, a felony is defined as anything that carries more than 12 months. So if you suddenly make 24 months be a misdemeanor, you are having a ripple effect through everything where the term felony or misdemeanor is used. And, so you're talking about people's rights, whether or not they can vote, things like that. You're changing all of that. So this is something I would say would be very, very careful. In regard to the idea of converting certain offenses to minor misdemeanors, I raised this issue in a motion for rehearing in the Jeng case, and that's the case that litigated the issue of whether or not you were entitled to a jury trial for a Violations Bureau case. I pointed out in rehearing that there are at least 3 of the offenses that Judge Jackson has talked about, HOV violations, open container, and a couple others, that you can't get any jail time. So how could you possibly be entitled to a jury trial? And the Supreme Court denied the rehearing. I picked up 1 vote. It went from 5-2 to a 4-3 decision. But the court basically says under the Georgia Constitution that if it is a criminal offense, you are entitled to a jury. So creating some other offense, may or may not be able to deal with that issue of suddenly not being able to have a jury trial. In other words, you may end up with, even if you say it in a statute, which the Violations Bureau statute said, it said you don't get a jury trial, it's by judge only. And the court said that doesn't matter because in Georgia you're entitled to a jury trial. So even if you said, okay, certain offenses, only have a $500 fine and no jail time, if they are criminal offenses in the state of Georgia, then you may get a jury trial. In other words, that issue I'm sure would be litigated again, and the same issue would be raised that was raised in the Jeng case, namely our Constitution says if it's a criminal offense, you get a jury trial. Now the problem is if you make it something other than a criminal offense, then you run into all these issues that the law enforcement people have raised, namely can you stop somebody for something that isn't a criminal offense? And you get all the search and seizure issues. So that's the problem and the interplay. And when I was preparing to do the litigation in regard to the Jeng case, I actually looked at a lot of these other states and found that a lot of them had these infractions and violations, but they also had run into that issue of how do you deal with the search and seizure issues, and it was not a simple matter. So I just wanted to caution the committee that as you go forward to be very, very careful of these issues because they're not real simple, and the repercussions of them can spread throughout not just traffic court problems, but throughout the whole criminal justice system by whatever you do. So if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Any questions for Joe? Thanks so much for bringing that to attention. I really appreciate you shedding a little more light on that. Who is here from ACCG or GMA? Who wants? Oh, yeah, okay, all right. Well, come on up. I bet I know what you're going to say.
Pretty quick. I don't think Deborah's here, so I think what we've heard today is that...
Why don't you tell everybody your name?
I'm Rushi Patel with GMA, and I think what we've heard here today is a long process that we've worked with Mike and the judges and a lot of other groups, and our concerns are similar to everyone else's concerns that's been expressed today. I think when you look at the solutions, a lot of the solutions might be administrative and giving judges and prosecutors more options. And I think that is where we'd like to see it go, and that's where we would like to see it go if it continues forward. We've had concerns with decriminalization, and we continue to have those, and it doesn't look like that's what anybody is looking towards at this point. So with that, I think we would say that what the majority of folks have said up here today is a similar position to where we are. So I'd be happy to take any questions.
Any questions? I don't see any. Thank you for being brief, and thank you for your views. Anybody else want to comment on this at all? Okay. You guys are coming back again? Chiefs, come on. Oh, I thought you were jumping up. Okay. Yeah, just being polite, as the chairman says here. Anybody else want to say anything for the good of the committee here? Well, that's great. The committee's going to adjourn to a particular room, 2:30 in the Capitol, and we had some lunches over there, and then we'll the compliments of Mr. Potter, and then we will discuss a little bit more on this. And we're going to wish you all a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, and be good to each other.